So in Chapter 5, we're going to be looking at more about how we can find the meaning in art by exploring some additional kinds of contexts. The meaning of a piece of artwork goes way beyond subject matter, way beyond the medium used. Historical context can help us read an artwork. As we explore these meanings, please keep in mind that there is a lot of crossover between the different contexts in this chapter and symbolism and iconography. Your book has a very good example for each type of context, and I really encourage you to read through each one of them. I know this can be some pretty deep stuff, and you would have to do some extensive research on every piece of art you see in order to get the full context of a piece. And I'm not expecting this deep of research from you guys on each artwork, but I do think you need to understand how we can get that depth of meaning. There are 5 categories of sociocultural context that are explained in your textbook. Many of these overlap. There's historical context, social context, a personal or creative narrative context, the political context, and a scientific context. Things that happen to a particular culture at a particular time have a way of showing up in the artwork of that period. The compare-contrast explanation of the still life works that are in your book give you an idea of how similar subject matter can be interpreted completely different. Here's a painting by Missouri artist George Caleb Bingham. The country election is what we call a genre painting. It tells the story of everyday people doing everyday things. Now, this painting shows how a rural election was run in the 1800s. Notice who is featured in the painting. There are no women. Women had not yet been given the right to vote, so the crowd here is male. This also gives it a social context, and there are a lot of different subtleties in here also, showing the interaction of people between each other. Here we see a painting by Peter Bruegel the Elder. This is also a genre painting that shows a group of peasants during a festival. Now, just like the previous painting, you can see something new every time you look at it. And seeing the interaction between the characters also gives you a look into that society at that time. The personal creative narrative context is a very difficult one to define because it typically relies on a narrative of the artist himself or herself. So it is more common with recent artworks where we have the artist's explanation. So here we're looking at 2 paintings by American artist Georgia O'Keeffe. Now, we read in a previous chapter that Georgia was taught in the traditional methods of creating art. However, she did not stay in that style. Instead, she decided to focus on what she thought made the art. Some artworks that have a political bent are very subtle, as with the painting in your book by Jian Jun. Other artworks speak out in a more forward manner. For example, Picasso's Guernica is one such artwork. During the Spanish Civil War, Spanish nationalists, with the aid of Nazi Germany, bombed the small Basque village of Guernica. With most of the men of the village away fighting, the bombing killed women and children. Picasso's painting uses a great deal of symbolism to explain the horror of this event and his reaction to it. So the Renaissance had a huge impact on science, and much of that was recorded by Leonardo da Vinci. What couldn't be observed by the naked eye really wouldn't be recorded until the invention of the camera. Da Vinci gave us the proportions of the human body and a lot of insight into inventions, both for practical use and also for warfare. Francesca Inuccello explored the mathematical components of linear perspective and gave that to the world. So now we're talking about symbolism and the iconography in artwork. So symbolism is the use of symbols to represent ideas or qualities. and iconography is the use of those symbols in a work of art. The alphabet is an example of symbols, graphic symbols that have specific sounds and meanings applied to each one. The Statue of Liberty is an example of an icon that typically represents freedom. The symbols and icons can change meanings over time. What a symbol means to one group or culture may mean something completely different to another one. And there could be slight changes or there could be radical changes. For example, with the trident and what today we associate with a symbol of the Trinity. The Christian cross is a symbol of Jesus Christ who was crucified on a cross. An earlier but similar symbol was the Egyptian Ankh. It was representational of the life-giving power of the sun. Not all symbol changes, though, are that simple. The swastika is probably the best example of a symbol that has changed over time. Its meaning changed from one of peace in the Eastern cultures to one of hatred with Nazi Germany. So understanding the context of symbols and icons is very much needed for visual literacy. Understanding how to read the artwork is also necessary. We said in an earlier chapter that Western culture reads left to right. Eastern culture reads right to left. And in ancient Sumner, in the example of the ritual vase from Waka, reads from the bottom to the top. This is what they call a hierarchical arrangement. The more important the figures are, the larger they are, while the less important objects or figures are smaller. Early cultures used symbols to tell stories of their history before they had a written record. Symbols were used to represent certain aspects of certain things. The myths of Greece and Rome had commonly understood meanings for people of that culture. The early Christian church did not have the Bible as such that individuals could have them. So they relied on storytelling. The Sistine Chapel is a prime example of artwork that's being used to tell the stories of the Bible. And they were painted in a way to tell the story the way the church wanted that told. So artwork could also be a pretty good messenger of propaganda. Some cultures have little left in the way of a historical record, but archaeological finds help us find out about them. One of the most interesting finds was discovered in 1939 in Suffolk. It was evident that the person who was buried at Sutton Hoo was an influential person, as the burial seemed to be a medieval monument to an unknown Anglo-Saxon king. Now, very little was known about this culture that flourished during the Dark Ages. And the Dark Ages were an era where civilizations in all aspects of life appeared to decline. During this period, also known as the Migration Period, which was 300 to 700 BC, before England was even England, civilizations navigated the English Channel to explore new lands. While this doesn't give us much history into this particular culture, it does give us some insight into some of the tales of warrior kings such as Beowulf. The cloisonne, or the metalworking on the shoulder clasp, is a technique that actually originated in the 3rd millennium BC in the Middle and Far East, indicating that this culture traded with many other cultures. The motif is a recurring fragment, theme, or pattern that appears in art. Motifs can carry varied meanings in varied contexts. For an example, a halo is usually a kind of visual shorthand that indicates a holiness or a divinity, as when indicating the Trinity. But there are different styles of halos representing the Holy Family or saints, And in some cultures, the halo is just a symbol of power and could be even used on figures like the beast or on Satan himself. So here we see some examples of how halos have been used. In the middle image, you have the Madonna and Child. Because those were definitely holy figures, we often see a halo around their heads. On the far right, you see Apollo, which was a Roman god who is portrayed here with the halo, meaning a power, something to do with the power of Apollo. In the one on the far left, you see all of the apostles along with Christ with halos around their heads, except for the one in the very front, who was Judas Iscariot. Metaphorical meanings can be even more difficult to understand. For example, a river and tears aren't very much alike. One's a body of water while the other is produced by our eyes. But they do have the thing in common that they are both types of water and flows. So this metaphor then uses the similarity to make a point. That point where her tears were a river flowing down her cheeks. In this instance, the metaphor is the chairs that are representing other things. This is 1,550 chairs stacked between two city buildings. And this was a statement about the thousands of anonymous migrants whose lives were upended by violence and terrorism. And she knew firsthand of this because of her own country that she came from. So here we have just a few of the key terms from the chapter. I do believe that this is a chapter that you really should read through yourself. Some of it is, it's a little difficult to wrap your head around, but it is good to know how art actually, not only does it affect us in other ways, but it's a great history tool.